So this is something that I've thought about for a while. Like, even before we knew what kind of game Final Fantasy 16 was going to be. But it's really hard to make good side characters from a gameplay perspective in real-time combat games. I've played a lot of games, from Kingdom Hearts to God of War to 7 Remake, and I enjoy all these games, but they all have different approaches to try to include side characters in gameplay. And these differences have their pros and cons, and obviously I have my favorite because I'm making this video, and I have to say that Final Fantasy 16's implementation is one of the things that got me excited early on. But of course, this isn't limited to just Final Fantasy 16. This is a broader discussion that looks at how game designers approach this problem of side characters in action-focused games. But why do I like Final Fantasy 16's implementation? Well, sit back and join me while I try to explain to you why side characters are so hard to design in real-time combat games. First and foremost, designing good AI for your side characters is really hard. In games like Kingdom Hearts, for example, Donald and Goofy both die constantly to damage because they can't seem to avoid attacks. Or I recently played Xenoblade 3, and I'd be using my DPS character and switch over to my healer just to find out that they used their healing ability 5 seconds ago that did effectively nothing, and now I'm gonna die for it. There are countless examples of games where AI characters don't do what you want them to do, or what you would do if you could control them. Part of this is because as a game designer, you have to consider that players of all skill levels will play the game. So in some respects, the programmer almost has to make the AI somewhat dumb and make mistakes, so the player can't just rely on the AI to do everything for them. Or in some games, what's being asked of the AI can be so complex that it can be hard to put exact numbers on what the AI should do in certain situations. For instance, again in Xenoblade 3, every character can be every class, so the programmers had to determine when the AI will use certain moves with every single combination. And then these moves have interactions with other moves, like for example, you may want to always daze an opponent after the enemy's toppled, but you also just don't want the AI to never use their ability if the enemy is never toppled. So as a game designer, you have to make some decision about how long the AI should hold this ability. Should it be 5 seconds, or 3 seconds, or 7 seconds? And these are all numbers that can get tweaked. You can layer this with, what if you have a party composition of 4 healers? What if you have a party composition of all tanks? The player can do things that could potentially break the AI if you don't try to consider every situation. And so I think that inherently forces the programmer to try to make AI dumb so it's more broad, if that makes sense. Because you can program more broad interactions rather than specific. But those broad interactions might not be as optimal for every situation. And this problem of AI even extends into strategy games like Civilization 6. I've played a lot of Civilization 6 in my day, and I think it's a pretty commonly known thing in the community that the difficulty levels in Civilization 6 kind of suck. And I'm sure there's a lot of reasons for this. You see, deity difficulty, which is the hardest difficulty in Civilization, doesn't make the AI any smarter than just normal. They start with more settlers, they start with more warriors, they start with more everything, more science, more culture. So they just have this massive boost that gives them a huge advantage over the player that is almost insurmountable unless you're min-maxing the game so hard that you can accelerate past them. And of course, I don't entirely blame this on the creators being lazy. Instead, I think it's difficult to try to program different difficulty levels for every single leader. You see, every leader has its own bonuses and its own optimal play route. There's a general optimal play route, like starting with building 2 scouts is generally considered optimal. They have unique units, they have unique buildings, they have other unique bonuses, and these bonuses can affect what their win condition might be. So ultimately, they can't make the AI too hard for lower difficulties, and they can't make it too easy. And it's also a huge amount of resources to make multiple levels of the AI. So they just end up making the one AI and adjusting it with different amounts of cheating. So yeah, it can be really hard to even decide how smart or dumb to make your AI. But that's not all. There's another issue that has plagued action game companions since their inception, and that is the problem of trying to make companions feel useful, but not too useful. Again, I'm going to pick on Donald and Goofy a bit from Kingdom Hearts. I think it's safe to say that both of them generally feel pretty useless, and I think there are multiple layers as to why. For starters, like I mentioned, they constantly die because they take too much damage. And then on top of that, they don't really do that much damage outside of limit breaks, which are player controlled anyway. Plus, you can't really give them items because they take so much damage that they'll just eat all of your potions up and you won't have anything left. And so you have this mix of eating your resources, not doing damage, taking too much damage, dying, that all build up to this feeling that Donald and Goofy are just kind of useless. But let's take a moment and imagine that Donald and Goofy took reduced damage and did as much damage as Sora. Now, suddenly with 2 AI companions at the same power level of the main character, you literally won't have to play the game anymore. And as I'm writing this, I'm struggling to think of a game exactly where the companions can pretty much play it for you, other than like Final Fantasy 12, but there you program the AI. And I think it's probably because game designers really don't want you to feel like you don't have to play the game unless it's an easy difficulty. So more often than not, we just end up with these useless companions, or at the very least ones that feel unoptimal and a little frustrating. So how do you solve this problem as a game designer? Well, I think you just have to look at the most recent AAA RPGs to get a good feel for how. I mean, if you look at games like God of War or Final Fantasy VII Remake, you notice that while they have side characters, their side characters don't really do much. In God of War, and more recently God of War Ragnarok, you have side characters that follow you along on your journey. These companions, however, don't really have HP, and besides the occasional grab from an enemy in God of War 2018, they basically never need your help. Then to make sure that they don't play the game for you, they don't really do any damage either. So why is it that no one really complains about God of War Ragnarok's companions? At least that I've seen. Well, I think there are two main factors. First, they give you an arrow shooting mechanic, which gives your companions something to do to feel useful, but it requires player input. So basically, they connect the companion with player inputs to make them feel useful. Second, they reduce the amount of customization available to them. In Kingdom Hearts, Donald and Goofy both have a full ability list and the same amount of equipment as Sora. Meanwhile, in God of War Ragnarok, you can give your companions a weapon, an armor set, and an accessory. That's it. Compared to Kratos, who has multiple weapons, handles for those weapons, 3 pieces of armor, a relic, and an amulet with up to 9 slots, this is an extremely simple loadout. So God of War Ragnarok made companions feel more useful by making them take and do no damage without the player input, and by making the player less invested in them by reducing customization. So what I'm trying to get at with the customization is that the player didn't have any sunk cost into customizing them. So you aren't looking for them to do increased damage. You aren't looking for them to take less damage because you didn't really do that much to customize them. Now let's take a look at Final Fantasy VII Remake and how they handle companions, because this is actually a lot different than God of War Ragnarok. In 7 Remake, companions have just as much customization as the main character, with their own unique playstyles. So the God of War factors don't really factor in here. Now, the companions that you aren't controlling also barely take any damage, as they block all the time, and they barely do any damage as, again, they block all the time. Also, 7 Remake has an ATB system, which is a bar that builds up over time, which lets you use abilities. The characters you aren't controlling basically don't build ATB. So if the companions in 7 Remake are fully customizable, but do nothing in combat, why don't people complain about them? Well, I think somewhat obviously because the player can swap control to any companion at any time. So instead, each companion feels more like a stance swap for the player than a useless party member. They become part of the gameplay and can fulfill specific roles like a mage or a healer or a damage dealer. So obviously these are two vastly different approaches to party members, and they both work. But in both of these cases, your companions basically never die and don't really do much damage without player input. And these were just 2 examples of recent games. I'm sure we could have a discussion for hours about the different games' implementations of side characters and how they affect combat. But I think the long and short of modern game design for companions is that you want the companions to feel somewhat useful to the player, while also not feeling like a hindrance or like they're completely playing the game for them. But at the beginning of this video, I said I actually like the way that Final Fantasy XVI is approaching companions. But if you know anything about Final Fantasy XVI, you'll know that it doesn't quite fall under the criteria of either of these games. So why is it that I like it? Well, let's start by analyzing what we know. Based on footage we've seen, it certainly doesn't look like the companions like Jill or Cid will kill mobs of enemies by themselves. If anything, they look a little weak. They do some damage, but not a lot. We have seen a couple scenes where I think the companions will have a big impact. We saw a mini-boss where Cid used some lightning ability which staggered the enemy and did a bunch of damage. And we know that Jill takes part in the Liquid Flame fight as Shiva. So my guess is during certain main story quest fights, our companions will do a little more than usual. But in general, I think they'll be relatively weak and doing their own thing on the side while we do most of the damage. We're also pretty sure that we can't customize them. It's possible that they haven't shown it yet, but at this point I think they would have shown it if it's in there. Torgal may be customizable, but for Jill or Cid, I don't expect there to be any customization. Oh, and mentioning Torgal, he might be customizable, but we know that we can give him commands much like Atreus in God of War. So there is one companion that will stay with us throughout the whole game that we will be able to use as an extension of gameplay. And finally, we know that most of the companions won't stay with us for very long periods of time on our journey. They'll rotate through. We'll have Cid following us for a bit, then Jill, then maybe Benedicta, and then maybe Jill again. So I think when you put all these puzzle pieces together, their decision makes a lot of sense. They wanted side characters who were their own characters doing their own thing, not linked to the main character. And so suddenly they had to remove customization because you didn't want to have the player customize them just for them to leave in 2 hours. I also think that they will have struck a good balance with making the companions feel useful. Won't really know until I play the game, but the fact that they can't die, but they also don't do too much damage, is in line with most games on the modern market. So the reason this got me so excited when all this information was first coming out is that I saw that the team had a vision for what they wanted to make, which was an action game, and they stuck to that vision. They didn't compromise their vision to avoid conflict with people who enjoyed the previous Final Fantasy games. And while it's that lack of compromise that annoys many people, to me, it's a sign that they had a vision, they stuck to it, and I think that it's a relatively good direction for an action game. And really, I think when you break it down like I just did, it makes a lot of sense from their perspective. So that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited for Final Fantasy 16. But like I said earlier, this discussion is really broader than Final Fantasy 16. I think if you're designing any action game in the modern day, these are all things you have to consider. These are all things that you can look for in whatever action RPG it happens to be that you're playing, or maybe when a new one is announced, you can look and try to see if their system will be a good system, because it is really hard to design good AI, especially for companions and especially in action games. But anyway, that's it for now. With all that said, I hope you enjoyed this video and my thoughts on this aspect of game design. This video is a lot different than my previous videos, obviously, and while I do wrap into a discussion about Final Fantasy 16, it really is a broader discussion about action RPGs in general and my opinions on one aspect of them. Since this is a bit of a new direction for the channel, let me know what you think. You can, of course, leave a like or maybe leave a comment. I read them all, so any feedback will be heard. Since this is a bit of a drought of news right now and my pace has dropped a bit, I'm starting to experiment with this different style of video as I start to think about what comes next after Final Fantasy 16 releases. Of course, if you're interested in this content or Final Fantasy 16, feel free to subscribe. Besides that though, there's really not much else to say. And of course, as always, I hope you have a good night.